13 young faces once lit up Britain's screens, smiling, singing, stealing scenes. For a moment, they were beloved. And then, the lights went out. Some vanished quietly. Others fell loudly. None walked away untouched. This is not a tribute, it's a reckoning. Behind every cheerful close-up was a countdown. Behind every laugh track, a quieter collapse. These are the stories the credits didn't show, of childhood fame and the cost it never refunds. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the stories they'd rather forget. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? Let's see who else is out there in the dark with us. 1. Matthew Garber. Before he ever knew the word fame, Matthew Garber had already been folded into the pages of British film history. At age 7, he was the cherub-faced boy floating above the streets of London with an umbrella-wielding nanny. Mary Poppins made him immortal, but only on film. Off-screen, Matthew's life was not technicolor. Unlike his co-star Julie Andrews, or even Karen Dautrice, who played his sister Jane, Matthew's story didn't spiral into long-standing fame or complicated adulthood. It barely became an adulthood at all. After a brief run of childhood roles between 1963 and 1967, he simply vanished from screens. No scandal, no fanfare, just a boy slipping out of the spotlight, as if exhaled by the very studio that had once inflated him into public memory. In his late teens, he reportedly contracted hepatitis while traveling. Some accounts say India, others are vague. What followed was a rapid, tragic deterioration. He died at the age of 21, with pancreatitis also cited in some reports. No big funeral, no national mourning, no decade-long retrospectives. One of the most iconic child faces of British cinema was gone before the 80s began. There's something especially haunting about stories like his, not because of some shocking downfall, but because of how quiet the fall was. Matthew didn't crash. He simply disappeared. He reminds us of a kind of tragedy that's often overlooked in our obsession with messy endings, the soft, muffled kind, where a child is consumed not by scandal but by circumstance. In an industry that so often spins youth into product, Matthew was used up young and then forgotten, until the internet began rediscovering him decades later as a footnote in Mary Poppins trivia. And even now, the facts of his death are often misremembered, misreported, or just blurred out entirely. That, too, is a kind of tragedy. To be remembered only by the silhouette of a character you played, not the person you were or the pain you carried. But if Matthew Garber's story was defined by silence, the next one was defined by noise. Tabloids, addiction, stage lights, and slurred applause. A boy once nominated for an Oscar, cheered by millions and undone by everything that came after. 2. Jack Wilde. Jack Wilde was the artful dodger, and the name fit too well. At 16, he was pint-sized charisma in a top hat, stealing scenes and maybe hearts in Oliver. He was the one you wanted to follow, the boy who knew the back streets and beat the system. For a moment in 1968, he wasn't just a British child star, he was the British child star. But of course, Dodger stories never end with escape. Jack didn't dodge the system. He became one of its most brutal cautionary tales. By his early 20s, Jack Wilde had already lived through the full cycle of celebrity. Fame, money, press, fan clubs, and then the collapse. He was drinking heavily before many people have finished university. Alcoholism didn't just erode his career, it stripped him of agency. Roles dried up, friends disappeared. His own body began to rebel. Later in life, Jack was diagnosed with oral cancer, a consequence of years of heavy drinking and smoking. Surgery took his voice, quite literally. The boy who once sang on stage and charmed cinema audiences across the globe could no longer speak. He described in interviews the eerie tragedy of living without the very thing that once made him famous. He died at 53. There's something particularly British about how Jack's story was handled in public. A mixture of distant pity and tabloid relish. He was trotted out in later interviews, visibly changed, sometimes framed as a relic. Like a vintage toy that once brought joy but now sits rusted on a shelf. But the real moral weight doesn't sit with Jack's choices. It sits with the machine that profited from his youth and then did nothing when the boy inside the costume couldn't stop spiraling. The system had no exit plan, no soft landing, just a memory hole. Jack Wild didn't lack talent. He lacked insulation. And maybe, just maybe, he lacked time. Because fame at 16 is a thief. It robs you twice, once of your childhood and once of your future. And yet, even Jack had moments of public sympathy. The next story didn't even get that. It's about a boy swallowed not just by the industry, but by the media itself, until even the facts of his death were swallowed too. 2 stories in, and we're only just getting started. If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you wide awake in Glasgow or half asleep in Toronto? Let's map the night together. 3. David Scarborough. When EastEnders first lit up British television in 1985, it wasn't just a soap, it was an institution in the making. And David Scarborough, playing original cast member Mark Fowler, was suddenly part of the national wallpaper. He was 17, angular-faced, brooding-eyed, and unmistakably seen. Not just seen by the viewers. Seen by tabloids. Seen by photographers. Seen by a press machine that didn't care what it was looking at, only that it had found something to sell. Mark Fowler was supposed to be a long-haul character, but the actor playing him was anything but predictable. David's discomfort with the spotlight was already obvious during his short run. By 1987, his appearances were sporadic. Rumors flew, papers invented and embellished. They painted him as difficult, troubled, unstable, terms that, when directed at young men, often say more about the system than the subject. What we now know, thanks to later reporting and family insight, is that David was struggling with the pressure, with the distortion of who he was, with an industry that offered him no pause, no protection, no privacy. He took legal action against libelous stories. But even his attempts to fight back became fuel. The press reportedly tracked him to a psychiatric facility. They didn't just invade, they monetized the invasion. In April 1988, he was found dead near Beachy Head. The coroner returned an open verdict. Not an accident, not anything definite, just open, like a door left ajar, like a life with too many questions and no one willing to ask them properly. Scarborough's story is now used, rightfully, as a warning about the speed of fame, about mental health, about how a young actor can be consumed not by scandal, but by silence. The industry shrugged. The tabloids moved on, and a 20-year-old was buried with more media mythology than actual memory. If David's tragedy was a storm, the next one was more of a slow leak, less public, less loud, but somehow just as devastating. A young actor who became the very first face of a beloved school drama, and yet died so quietly that no one noticed, for weeks. 4. Terry Sue-Patt. He was the first kid through the gates, literally. When Grange Hill debuted in 1978 and cut to its iconic opening sequence, it was Terry Sue-Patt, playing Benny Green, who walked in first. Afro, blazer, the picture of late 70s British schoolboy charm. He wasn't just part of the show. He was the show's beginning. And then, slowly, like chalk washed off a board, he was gone. After his run on Grange Hill ended in the early 80s, Terry drifted into the strange middle space that child actors often inhabit. Recognizable but not famous. Friendly-faced but not bankable. He did a few roles, kept in touch with some old colleagues, and was largely remembered by nostalgic adults whenever a rerun aired. But professionally, he faded. Publicly, he evaporated. What makes Terry's story sting isn't just the absence of stardom, it's the absence of anyone noticing. In 2015, police were called to his flat after neighbors raised concerns. Reports later revealed that his body may have gone undiscovered for over a month. The cause of death wasn't treated as suspicious, but everything around it was tragic. Isolation, disconnection, silence. There's something eerily poetic about it. The boy who ushered Britain into its most famous school television series died alone, quietly, and almost anonymously. This was no scandal, no legal case, no media firestorm, just a man left behind by an industry that had long since moved on. Friends and former castmates mourned him, of course. The obituaries used words like gentle, kind, beloved. But the deeper, darker truth lay in the timing. By the time the public remembered him, he was already gone. And the thing that brought him back into headlines was the very thing that could no longer help him. Terry's ending underlines a recurring theme. The entertainment world doesn't just discard child stars when they grow up. It forgets they were ever real. It remembers the character, not the actor, the freeze frame, not the fade-out. But at least Terry got a memorial. The next name on this list was remembered mainly for a performance in a quirky children's show, and then suddenly for the news that came after she stopped breathing. 5. Charlotte Coleman. For British kids of the late 1970s and early 80s, Charlotte Coleman was that peculiar magnetic face from children's TV. In Wurzel Gummidge, she played Amy, bright, emotive, and slightly otherworldly in the way only child actors can be when they seem both too young and too wise for the role. But Coleman didn't stay in that early career lane. She graduated to adulthood in the industry with rare success, carving out space in more serious, grown-up cinema. Her most remembered performance came in 1994, playing Scarlett, roommate to Hugh Grant's character, in 4 Weddings and a Funeral. It was a defining role, chaotic, fiercely loyal, hilariously blunt. She stole entire scenes without stealing attention. Audiences who had watched her grow up were struck by the range, the suddenness of her emotional maturity on screen. But off-camera, Charlotte battled demons that didn't make it into the spotlight. She suffered from long-term mental health struggles, particularly depression and an eating disorder. She also lived with the constant weight of grief after losing her sister to cancer. Friends described her as brilliant, funny, and deeply private. She was someone who carried everyone else's burdens in conversation, but rarely offered her own. In 2001, she died suddenly at the age of 33 from an asthma attack. There was no public spectacle, no creeping scandal, just a final punctuation mark no one was expecting. The abruptness of it was jarring. One day she was here, acting, laughing, breathing. And then she wasn't. The kind of ending that leaves you staring at the credits, wondering if the reel jammed. Her story is a different kind of child star tragedy, not one of collapse or crime, but of fragility, of someone who managed, by all accounts, to transition from childhood fame into adult artistry, only to be cut off by the kind of medical emergency that makes no moral sense. There's no justice angle, no systemic failure to litigate, just loss. And sometimes that's the hardest kind to process. When there's no clear villain, no chain of poor choices, just a talented human being vanishing without the dramatic buildup we've come to expect in showbiz downfalls. The next name on our list didn't vanish quietly. He was just getting started. And then one night, in a city full of strangers, his story ended before it could even begin. 6. Rob Knox. You probably don't know much about Rob Knox, and if you do, it's likely for one reason: Harry Potter. He played Marcus Belby, a minor but memorable role in The Half-Blood Prince. The kind of role that puts a young actor on the map, especially when that map is the most successful British film franchise in decades. Rob wasn't a household name. Yet. He was just beginning the climb. Auditions, screen tests, press buzz, maybe even a sequel if the character got more screen time. There was promise. The feeling of almost. But promise doesn't protect you from the world outside the studio lot. In 2008, before the film even released, Rob Knox was killed. News of his death sent a ripple across the UK, not just because he'd been in Harry Potter, but because of how young he was. 18. On the edge of everything. His death was covered in the press, not as a tabloid scandal, but as a national gut punch. A young life intersecting with random violence, ending in a way that felt more like a headline than a eulogy. Rob's story isn't one of fame-induced downfall. It's about the disconnect between on-screen invincibility and real-world fragility. He was, for all intents and purposes, a normal teenager who just happened to land a golden ticket franchise gig. But he didn't live long enough to see it released. In interviews after his death, cast and crew members expressed the same sentiment. He was kind, excited, eager. He wasn't jaded or broken by the industry. He hadn't been chewed up or discarded. He was still becoming. And then the story stopped mid-sentence. There's a tendency in public memory to flatten Rob's narrative into a tragic trivia fact. Did you know one of the actors died before the movie came out? But that cheapens the larger truth. He wasn't a side note. He was a young man whose life collided with a system, entertainment, publicity, fandom, and was abruptly erased from it. Some tragedies happen slowly. Others are so fast, they leave an echo. And the next name on our list? He lived long enough to carry that echo forward, into scandal, into headlines, and eventually into a courtroom. 7. John Alford. He was Robbie Wright in Grange Hill, the cheeky one, the quick-talking one, the kid who seemed born to be in front of a camera. For a while, John Alford was one of those names that lived comfortably in the corners of British pop culture. Child actor, teen heartthrob, poster boy for the mid-1980s. From school drama to firefighter in London's Burning, Alford didn't just survive the child star phase. He upgraded. Gritty adult roles, steady TV gigs, even a pop career with some chart flirtation. The kind of transitional success that, on paper, should have been a safe landing. But the paper doesn't show what happens when the spotlight fades and the floor gives way. By the 2000s, John Alford's story had taken a left turn. There were already signs, public scandals, legal trouble, brushes with the press that suggested a life increasingly lived in the aftermath of fame rather than within it. But it wasn't until 2026 that everything snapped into full public view. That year, he was convicted and sentenced to over 8 years in prison for offenses involving underage girls. No denials, no sensational courtroom twists, just a grim, conclusive judgment. And here the moral center of the story shifts. Unlike other child stars on this list, Alford's downfall isn't framed as merely tragic. It's criminal. There are real victims, real harm. Whatever sympathy once existed for the boy who made us laugh on BBC. One has to contend now with the man who betrayed his position of trust in devastating ways, which raises an uncomfortable tension in how we tell stories like this. There's a cultural instinct to view former child stars as forever frozen in time, as if the kid we watched on VHS still somehow lives inside the adult. But innocence doesn't fossilize, and nostalgia does not erase responsibility. The real question, then, isn't how John Alford fell from grace. It's how many people mistook the boy he once played for the man he became. And in that, confusion, what got overlooked or allowed. But if Alford's story was one of disgrace in the courtroom, the next on our list is a parallel tale, with a younger actor, different charges, and the same harsh reminder that early fame doesn't predict moral compass. 8. Joseph Shade. Joseph Shade entered the EastEnders universe as Peter Beale, a character so enduring in the show's mythology that half the country has forgotten how many actors have worn the role. But Shade was one of the originals, stepping into the soap limelight in the late 90s as a fresh-faced kid with soap opera genes. For a time, he was a small but recognizable part of that domestic wallpaper, the kind of actor whose face made adults nod and say, "He's from that show, isn't he?" When his time on EastEnders ended, Shade followed a path that many former child actors take: relative obscurity. He pivoted to working in youth outreach, a seemingly natural choice for someone who had lived a very public childhood. The story might have ended there, quietly, respectably, had things not taken a darker direction. In 2017, Shade pleaded guilty to multiple offenses involving teenage girls, offenses made worse by his position as a youth worker. The court statements outlined a pattern of communication and contact that violated trust and legal boundaries. This wasn't a case of stardom gone sour. This was moral collapse, and one that left real consequences in its wake. Unlike Alford, Shade wasn't a household name by the time of his trial. His fame had long since faded. But that's what made the case all the more disturbing. He didn't trade on fame. He didn't use celebrity. He simply misused trust. The kind given not to actors, but to adults in positions of authority. Once again, we're forced to confront a deeper issue in the child star mythology. When the cameras stop rolling, who takes responsibility for these young people? Who ensures they receive real moral grounding? And when they don't, when the cracks show years later, how much do we attribute to personal failure, and how much to an ecosystem that cared more about child performance than adult character? Joseph Shade was once part of the most-watched soap in Britain. Now his legacy sits somewhere far removed from the screen, in court records, in damaged reputations, in questions that don't have easy answers. And if you're thinking all these stories seem to spiral down, the next one is different. Hers didn't collapse overnight. It crumbled, rebuilt, relapsed, and then just kept going. Not an ending. A loop. 9. Danniella Westbrook. In the early 1990s, Danniella Westbrook was pure EastEnders gold, fiery, young, and endlessly watchable as Sam Mitchell. She was the kind of star that tabloids loved and teenagers copied, with her bold looks and bigger-than-life energy. By her late teens, she was one of the most recognizable faces on British television. For a while, it seemed like the industry had a new, homegrown icon on its hands. But Britain has a habit of building up its child stars only to watch them crack in slow motion. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a decades-long unraveling that played out in near constant public view. Westbrook's life became less about the scripts she acted in and more about the headlines written around her. Addiction, hospitalizations, public relapses, mental health interventions, each moment served up for public digestion by the very machine that once celebrated her youth. And yet, Danniella never disappeared. She became a kind of tragic recurring character in her own life story. Documentaries were made. Interviews were granted. She even wrote about it herself, giving sobering detail about what life looked like behind the curtain of fame. She described the isolation, the destructive coping mechanisms, and the struggle to build something stable out of so many broken years. What makes Westbrook's story particularly unnerving is how performative her suffering became, how the line between private pain and public spectacle was blurred again and again. British tabloids are not known for their mercy, especially when a woman begins to fall apart in slow, visible stages. And Westbrook became an open invitation for mockery, sympathy, ridicule, and exploitation. Often all at once. But this isn't just a story of personal missteps. It's a case study in what happens when a teenager becomes famous in a country with very little infrastructure to handle the mental, emotional, and medical fallout. Westbrook was the product of that system, and later, one of its most visible warnings. She's still alive, still fighting, and that, in a way, makes her story even harder to file away. There's no closure, just the constant threat of another relapse, another tabloid headline, another public forgetting followed by a sudden remembering. And just as her life became a long unraveling, the next story is about someone who burned brightly for a moment, and then vanished almost entirely, except for the tabloid whispers that followed long after the final credits rolled. 10. Lynn Frederick. In the 1970s, Lynn Frederick was on the cusp of being everything the British film industry wanted from its starlets. Young, beautiful, photogenic, and talented. Her breakout in No Blade of Grass positioned her as a serious teenage presence. Her role in Voyage of the Damned reinforced that potential. She wasn't just a pretty face. She was poised, precise, and already stacking up major screen time before the age of 22. But for most people, Lynn Frederick is remembered not for her performances, but for her marriage to Peter Sellers. She was his fourth wife and much younger. The tabloids spun that relationship into a soap opera of its own. After Sellers' death, Frederick inherited his estate, and public opinion turned swiftly. She was labeled a gold digger, blamed for everything from his declining health to the estate battles that ensued after his passing. None of it was simple, of course. It never is. But the media treatment of Frederick became a case study in how quickly British fame can turn into British folklore, distorted, mean-spirited, and lacking in nuance. Her acting career slowed, then stalled, then stopped. By the 1990s, she had faded almost entirely from public view. Interviews became rare. Screen appearances were non-existent. The last chapter of her life played out in relative obscurity. In 1994, she died at 39 from a cerebral hemorrhage, an abrupt end to a life already retreating into silence. Looking back, what's tragic isn't just that Lynn died young, it's that she was largely forgotten before she died. The roles, the acclaim, the ambition, all smothered beneath decades of gossip, vilification, and public scorn. And for what? For marrying someone famous? For inheriting something? For aging out of the roles she used to play? Lynn Frederick's story reads like a cautionary tale wrapped in a character assassination. She wasn't ruined by scandal in the conventional sense. She was erased by a narrative that saw her less as a person and more as a problem to be solved by bad headlines. But while her tragedy unfolded in a slow private retreat, the next one came in an instant. An environmental disaster, a mother's voice on the news, and a fire that took more than just a home. 11. Rory Sykes. He wasn't the most famous name on this list. In fact, you'd be forgiven for not recognizing Rory Sykes at all, unless you were watching British children's television in the mid-1990s. He was a staple of kiddie capers, one of those vibrant, slightly chaotic kids' shows that were equal parts storytime and sing-along. Sykes was the cheerful boy with the unmissable curls, always on cue with a smile, always too composed for his age, the kind of child star who seemed born to perform. But unlike many others on this list, Sykes didn't spend his adulthood chasing the ghost of that childhood fame. He didn't crash on reality TV or spiral into tabloids. Instead, he grew up, stepped away from the camera, and built a different kind of life. Quietly, deliberately. In his 20s, he moved abroad and began working in disability advocacy. He became a speaker, a counselor, a voice for others. And for a while, that was the story. A child star who found peace. Unraveling. No public spectacle. Just a man who used his platform to amplify others. It was almost too tidy, too rare. Then came the fire. In 2025, wildfires swept across parts of California, the kind that consume not just forests, but towns, homes, lives. Rory Sykes was among the casualties. Authorities later confirmed he died of carbon monoxide poisoning. His mother, speaking to the press through tears, explained how there wasn't time to reach him. His body was discovered in a part of the house that had already collapsed. He was 32. His death made headlines for a few days, mostly in American outlets. British coverage came later, almost as a footnote. Former child actor among wildfire victims. But the coverage never quite captured the dissonance. How a boy once lit by studio lamps ended his life amid literal flames. Not as a celebrity, but as a person. As someone who had tried to do good with the time he was given. Rory's tragedy doesn't ask for moral interpretation. It just is. A quiet life, a violent end, and the uncomfortable realization that even those who escape the pitfalls of fame aren't immune to randomness. Or to fate. And speaking of fate, what happens when fame doesn't destroy a person outright, but just gradually drains them? What does it look like when childhood success becomes adulthood attrition? The next story isn't about death. It's about damage, legal, personal, and systemic. And the boy who learned too late that the spotlight doesn't come with a safety net. 12. Freddie Bartholomew. Long before Hogwarts and EastEnders, British child fame belonged to the 1930s. And Freddie Bartholomew was its crown jewel. With his aristocratic diction and mop of perfect hair, he embodied a kind of idealized English boyhood that filmmakers adored. Audiences, too. In classics like David Copperfield, Little Lord Fauntleroy, and Captains Courageous, he didn't just act. He defined the golden era of British child performance in Hollywood. By age 14, Bartholomew was one of the most bankable child stars in the world. Not just a local success, but a transatlantic sensation. The money rolled in. The contracts got longer. The press grew louder. On the surface, it looked like a charmed existence, but beneath the studio polish was something far less magical. Freddie was living in a legal battlefield. As soon as his earnings became significant, a bitter custody and financial war broke out between relatives, his biological parents and his aunt, who had been raising him. The details shifted from headline to headline, but one thing remained constant. Bartholomew was a child being fought over not for love, but for money. And that money? Much of it vanished. Legal fees, settlements, mismanagement. By the time he aged out of the roles that made him famous, the fortune was a memory. He wasn't destitute, but he wasn't protected either. The real tragedy of Freddie Bartholomew isn't that he fell apart. It's that he didn't get the future his childhood had promised. He lived until 1992, working behind the scenes in television advertising, largely out of the public eye. No dramatic fall from grace, just a slow fade into normalcy, tinged with the knowledge that he'd once been everywhere, and then nowhere. Freddie's story is a blueprint for the exploitation model that would quietly shape the child star industry for decades. Adults controlling the finances, institutions failing to safeguard young performers, fame turning into currency for everyone except the child. He wasn't ruined by scandal. He was worn down by a system that never intended to let him keep what he earned. And if you think that's an old problem, think again. Because our final story lands not in the black and white past, but in the uncomfortable present, where fame, trauma, and institutions still collide, with no clear path to justice. 13. Ben Fellows. Ben Fellows was the kind of child actor whose fame was subtle, recognizable, but not towering. In the 1990s, he appeared in small roles on British television, the sort of appearances that didn't dominate magazine covers but left impressions nonetheless. He moved through the industry as many young performers did, part of the supporting cast, bouncing between sets, brushing shoulders with bigger names, and absorbing the strange etiquette of show business far too young. But Ben's real notoriety would come much later, and not through any film or performance. In adulthood, he resurfaced not as an actor, but as an accuser. He publicly claimed to have been the victim of misconduct by a prominent political figure during his youth, allegations that threw him into a storm of media attention, political scrutiny, and legal entanglement. The details were complex, the reactions polarized, and the coverage relentless. He was later prosecuted for allegedly fabricating those claims, a charge that itself became a flashpoint in a larger conversation about who gets believed and why. After a high-profile trial, Ben Fellows was acquitted. But by then, the damage had already been done, reputationally, emotionally, and publicly. He had become, unwillingly or not, a symbol in a cultural debate that extended far beyond his own story. And that's the tragedy. Not a fall from fame, not self-destruction, but a drawn-out public ordeal in which the individual became secondary to the narrative being constructed around him. Whether you believed him or not, the toll of being at the center of such a storm, of having your childhood, your memories, your identity dissected by strangers, is hard to fully grasp. He didn't just lose a reputation. He lost control of the lens through which he was seen. In interviews, Fellows has spoken about feeling unsupported, isolated, and targeted. Whether you see him as a whistleblower or as someone caught in a maelstrom of mistaken strategy, the system failed to offer clarity. His story is now suspended in that uncomfortable space where no resolution satisfies and no outcome feels clean. Ben Fellows represents a final, bitter irony in the lineup of fallen child stars, that even when someone survives the industry, they may not survive its aftershocks. The stories we've told across these 13 lives don't just illustrate individual fates. They map a recurring failure of institutions, of protection, of memory. And that's what lingers after the credits roll. Not just sadness, but a question. How many more stories like these remain untold, quietly unraveling in the spaces between nostalgia and neglect?